leadership development. And I think very pertinently and deliberately focused this way, she's talking to us tonight about context in many forms. And I think we've seen this around COVID. I don't know if you're going to mention COVID, but it seems apposite in these times when society is under such stresses and strains. So anyway, she's widely published, and as well as joining us as professor, which we're delighted about, she's also joining us as research lead, which I am really delighted about, and is too. The whole university is. Klaus Fischer's also happy as well. But already we're having great discussions, and I can see that leadership is not only her subject matter, but also in her nature, and I mean that in a very good way. Doris, welcome to you. You have half an hour or so. Hold the questions, folks. Fire away in the chat, and we'll marshal those. We'll get your questions to Doris at the end, but let's not interrupt her, because these are short, sweet, compact sessions for our new staff and for staff doing interesting things. So without further ado, having already said that once, Doris, the floor's yours.
Yeah, thank you. So thanks very much, John, and thanks for the warm welcome. And I've just seen a message from Ben with welcome. Thank you. I'm really glad to join London Met. I will turn my video off now as I'm sharing my presentation, just to make sure everything goes well. I can see the rain coming, but hopefully it will not intervene with the presentation, which is sometimes can on my laptop. Hopefully it's showing up. Yes, fantastic. So, as Don said, a core part of my research is around context, and I would like to share today with you some particular research. Oh, this is coming out interesting. The dots, I'm not sure why that's doing that, but hopefully you can read this. So part of my research has always been around context, and I have been involved in a research project with a colleague at Oxford Brookes, Sylvia Chiuk, that particularly looks at, or where we've tried to analyse and highlight the importance of or considering context in leadership development. And in this presentation today, I'll share some of our insight, and these are still emerging, around what we saw as some of the core contextual influences on a private sector organisation's attempt to implement a distributed form of leadership, and the lessons we can learn from applying a deeply contextual approach to that. Now, as Don said, I will actually reflect a little bit on what I feel we can learn from that for the current situation, more from the point of view of, using a contextual approach to make sense of the multiple contextual influence on us, on our academic life, but also some of the short-term and long-term implications that may have for developing our personal leadership, our academic leadership, and our careers in an academic leadership context. So maybe I start by showing that our approach to leadership development, and I do apologise. This if you can see those odd black dots, these somehow have made their way into the presentation. So if anybody can't read what's on the slides, I'm very happy to circulate if anybody's interested afterwards. So our approach to leadership development really was both in our research as well as, I guess, the way we teach and approach leadership development is to see leadership development as an organizationally embedded phenomenon. And what we mean by that is that it goes beyond just looking at the role of formal training, and formal training being classroom-based training, where individuals who've been maybe identified as leaders come and learn about their own leadership, behaviours, approaches, attributes, and about other potential ways in which they could lead. But seeing it as an embedded organisation phenomenon also means paying attention to situated practice and how naturally occurring leadership learning is, and we don't often are aware of that, but it's highly influential on our practice as leaders or our observations on leadership. So situated means, and here's where the contextual approach immediately comes in, is paying attention to how our learning about leadership, our developing of our leadership practice is situated within the historical and social context of the organisation that we're in. So when we adapt the leadership role, and I reference here a study where Kempster as an academic helped Stuart, the practitioner, to reflect on her first few days as a COO, situated practice and learning means that when we adopt a leadership role, like Stuart did as a COO, we immediately engage in behaviours that really are influenced not just by formal training that we attend, but also experiences we have had in life in this particular organisational context. And what we observe from notable others, our expectation on us and our actions in that new role. And becoming more attuned to seeing leadership development like that, then also should influence our approach to not only researching leadership development, but also informing practice and paying more attention to organisational context. And that's backed up by a number of calls over the last 20 years to really think in our design and practice of leadership development more about to what extent it's culturally attuned, and where an organisation is, for example, trying to develop new leadership competencies, how that needs to be supported by changes in organisational practices for individuals to be able to develop their leadership as such. But in general also, I think organisations don't often think enough about this learning that takes place situated in practice. And Dane Harrison very much nudges to explore further the role of the interpersonal context in leader and leadership development. And that, I guess, is where Sylvia's and my research really has come in, trying to address this sort of absence of a focus on organisationally situated research, because most research into leadership development really looks at the formal classroom setting, and particularly to pay attention to the whole process of designing leadership development in all its forms, whether it is as a formal training program, in the form of a leadership model, competencies, or indeed appraisal processes that are trying to evaluate the success, the relative success an organisation has in developing leadership. So with our research, which is case-based, we really try to look at the fringes around the formal training. So what happened before a particularly in-house-based leadership development program and afterwards, and I'll explore in of course in much more detail what are the sort of findings were, what happened in that particular workplace. But before I delve into the ins and outs of the particular organisation and the case study that we analysed there, I'll just say a couple of things about distributed leadership, because this private sector organisation, which I'll introduce shortly, was responding to performance pressures, or rather pressures to improve their performance, and attempted to do so by moving from quite a traditional heroic leadership model where you see, you know, the CEO or the people at the top as the main leaders, towards a distributed leadership model. So meaning spreading leadership across levels and really encouraging everybody to view leadership as something that resides not just with individuals, but within the wider organizational system. Now that is and has been at that time and still is quite a popular approach that many organizations are trying to take. Why? Because they often see that as a means to growing leadership capability. So, you know, the old saying, don't rely on too few people, but really encouraging everybody to see leadership as something that is in them, that is their responsibility. And research has shown that, as Lloyd and Carol referred to, it has shown that spreading leadership like that really can help with creativity, can help with more innovative decision making, and it can, where it works well, really boost staff's morale. Okay. So in some public sectors, it's
Hi everyone, I think we've lost Doris's connection. She did have a weak connection. We imagined there might be a problem with her visuals, but not her voice. So I do have slides that I can...
Sorry, I was gone there for a minute. I think I'm not entirely...
Great, fantastic.
Back now, sorry. So what I was going to say is although this has been very popular and I guess role modeled by tech companies like Google, who very successfully adopted distributed leadership culture, but what is not often understood enough is that it needs to be more than the rhetoric of distributing leadership. It needs to actually be followed up by aligning all structures, roles, and values to really embrace leadership as something that really resides in the whole organization. And Google, of course, that's facilitated through shared spaces that allow for concerted action, where collaboration almost comes neutrally because it is very teamwork based. The spaces that people inhabit in offices and really encourage collaboration. Roles are aligned in that sense, but also processes are set up to enforce almost multi-directional decision making, mutual influencing. Yeah, and you need that kind of structural and relationship and role-based embracing of distributed leadership for it to really work. Unfortunately, such strong forms of distributed leadership are quite rare because it is very difficult to maintain. And again, for my later reflections on the case study and maybe also our current COVID situation, that's very important to bear in mind. So often we see attempts for distributed leadership waning when the pressures, financial pressures or complexity takes over and there's a hankering back to central decision making. So that as a little broad introduction to our approach to leadership development and also understanding of distributed leadership, which is what the particular organization we researched was trying to develop. Okay, now I'll move on now to discussing our particular research project. So as I said, we adopted a case study approach and a contextual approach, and not only gathering data, but also analyzing data. So the contextual approach here, informed by John's and some of my previous research into context, where we pay attention to, in this project, two particular levels and the influences that come from those levels of context. The wider omnibus context, macro level, societal, institutional, environmental influences, and the more discrete organizational and team-based context with immediate tasks, social and physical context that individuals are facing. And then really how each of these influence, in this case, leadership development, and how they interact with each other. Now, contextual, for us, it was important to look at this case study from a longitudinal and in-depth perspective. Okay, so our analysis started with observations and document analysis of the plans and design of the leadership development program, the workshops itself, and again the documentation, as well as semi-structured interviews before the leadership development event and afterwards. And that really was very important for us in order to capture the variety of contextual influences and to make sense of what we were seeing, the themes that were emerging to us from this quite wide range of data. Okay, so who was this organization, or what kind of organization? Pharmacy pseudonym, was a Polish, or is a Polish pharmaceutical company with quite a troubled past. So they have an American parent company who for quite some time sent expatriate managers. We entered the organisation after the last expatriate manager had departed and had left the organisation in quite a bit of turmoil. So there was high turnover, poor performance, and quite a lot of mistrust. A Polish manager, the Polish national manager, was started and really had the mission to turn the company around, improve performance, and re-establish a good working culture. To do that, he brought in some senior managers and hired a consultant company to do a little bit of research and audit of the company. Now, their study showed a lack of leadership capacity, particularly middle management level, which then prompted the senior managers and the managing director to develop a leadership model that, following the suggestion of the consultants, had a distributed aim. Okay, so its aim was to promote and develop leadership amongst all employees. The message that was in the documentation very much was along the lines of everybody should be a leader. Leadership is the thing that should be desired and should be enacted by everybody. This was then followed up, so the development of the leadership model, it was communicated to the whole workforce and followed up by some development workshops that took place over a span of a few months, and that taught the leadership competencies or leader competencies embedded in the model to the workforce. Okay. Taking this longitudinal approach and really in our analysis of it, looking deeply at exactly how the organisation arrived at this point of starting the leadership development programme and then delivering it, we really discovered how important it was to recognise the key driver behind this very leadership model, the drive towards distributed leadership, and that the existing performance issue and responding better to parent company pressures and sector-wide pressures was really the prime driver and the key sort of reason for the senior managers and the managing director to communicate to the workforce, look, this is something that's important that we need to do, otherwise we may not survive. Okay. Then conducting interviews with staff who took part in the leadership development workshop, particularly middle managers and senior managers, pre and post both the design and the implementation of the leadership program, showed that despite the very distributed leadership ethos of the leadership model and all of the documentation and the reassurances that really leadership is sorry, back on. the interviews were really quite stark in terms of suggesting that the employees across all levels perceived the actual model with stated competencies to be still very individualistically focused. And whilst maybe the workshops were designed to show intent of the senior managers, the perception of its implementation was one of quite top-down focus, which really just, rather than challenging the previous heroic leader at the top type of discourse, ended up just reinforcing that. And people were still actually talking, even the senior managers, about the CEO or the managing director as the main leader upon whom the direction of the company really depended. Okay, now that then created tensions, and the post-leadership development interviews were quite strongly infused by these narratives around tensions of enactment with this distributed leadership model, of managers saying, look, our everyday practice is still so fundamentally focused around our managerial responsibilities. Senior managers were so pressed to show performance improvement that they struggled to move away from a focus on hierarchy, from a focus on top-down decision making. Relationships in place, which you call sort of socio-material relationships, or roles and enactment of roles, how people saw each other, the extent to which they could influence each other, remained very hierarchical. Okay, so middle managers continue to talk about how whenever they tried to take up leadership, they were put down, or senior managers were seen to draw back control. Okay. Now that in itself was suggesting to us already that the attempt to develop distributive leadership through presenting it as important to the workforce, through this leadership model, through the workshops where they explained the importance and the leader competencies, really had no impact on the lived reality. So the lived reality was at a discrete level, and this is where trying to separate out influences of an omnibus and a discrete level helped us further making sense of this, because at discrete level, the immediate task, the way in which roles were enacted, decisions were made, just couldn't move away from a very hierarchical, bureaucratic, and individualistic nature. Okay, so hence the inability to change these structures, the inability to change the social material relationships, were working against the normative force of the distributive aim of this whole leadership development program. Now, by paying a little bit more attention to the parent company and wider omnibus factors of the financial pressure on the organisation, helped us to realise how such a wider contextual influence not only served as the reason for wanting distributed leadership, but simultaneously acted actively to undermine the enactment of distributed leadership, because the financial pressure really caused senior managers to feel pressurized to draw back control, pressurized to implement even more competitive individualistic performance measures that all really counteracted the attempt to institutionalize collaboration, to enable multi-directional influencing decision making. Okay, so our argument then, in conclusion of this particular case, would be it was only by taking a longitudinal approach, by paying very careful attention to different layers of context and how the omnibus and the discrete context interacted, how the discrete context wasn't changed enough, wasn't able to change enough, and for therefore the attempt at a higher level to change the ethos towards distributed leadership failed. Now, I'd like to spend the last 5 minutes or so on indeed reflecting a little bit on our very own context in the moment. Now, I said earlier that the idea of distributed leadership has always been very appealing within higher education, because we're already working often in matrix structures and encouraged to take up individual leadership, be it at a modular or course level, or at a more management level. Now, I think that the current pandemic situation, if we again take maybe nested a contextual approach, we may be able to understand how it's presenting to us really quite complex contextual challenges that might have quite significant long-term implications on our ability to enact academic leadership in a distributed way, but also may impact long-term development opportunities of leadership. Okay, so I'll elaborate a little bit on that. First of all, if we try and understand COVID from a nested approach, contextual approach, then we can see how just over the last 3-4 months we have seen some huge contextual influences on our academic lives at an omnibus level through the imposed lockdown and the social distancing measures in a way that has been so out of our control, so unpredictable, that is really unprecedented, and at a discrete individual, group, organizational level has had a knock-on effect and evoked further changes. So there, the move to remote working practices, which for some feel really isolating, and the enforced increased use of learning technologies for teaching, but also for meetings and communication, has brought profound changes to mature relationships. So the way we take up our roles, the way we're able to relate to each other, the way we maybe even speak and communicate with each other, yeah, which can be quite different via email or virtual meetings compared to face-to-face. Now, colleagues at Henley, Walker and colleagues have done already a quick sort of study into the lived reality of academic staff during this pandemic. And probably for us, not surprisingly, what they found, again, were really quite profound changes as a result of these omnibus and discrete contextual influences. So these enforced changes to the way we're working. In a teaching setting, the need to learn new ICT skills quickly and remotely and to do online marketing, etc., has really worked for some, but for others, it has led to experiences of being very tired, unable to keep levels of mental resilience and energy up, more time consuming than it normally would have been, and for some real difficulty engaging where the students really understand what is taught, and therefore a lack of being able to, in a way, get affirmation that what we're doing as academic module leaders, as teachers, is appropriate or is valid. So that can be quite, for some again, quite a difficult experience. In a research setting, some research is really being squeezed out because time has had to be made for teaching or COVID-related meetings. Certainly, qualitative methodologies will be for some time disadvantaged over other methodologies, and some funding possibly diverted. Also, with regards to work engagement, again, whilst the remote working, as I suggested, may for some, for others, it's really isolating. And then in additional teaching and home time pressures, where, for example, individuals have parental responsibilities or other caring responsibilities. Now, Walker et al. Really raised concerns that not only is it impacting people's abilities to feel effective as academic leaders, right, a role in the moment, but also may have some long-term implications for academic leadership development, career development, and potential promotions that we need to be aware of. And really, their suggestion is now, if ever, is the time for line managers and colleagues to come together and to think about how can we work together collaboratively to maintain people's ability to engage with work, and to ensure that particular groups of staff are not disadvantaged. So on the surface, this may just reinforce a call for trying to embrace a more distributed leadership approach, where we really give individuals a sense sense of voice, a sense of empowerment, of responsibility and accountability, one where they feel, they are able to collaborate effectively, where they're able to influence upwards as well, to feel in control at a time where everything seems to be out of control. But, and this is my last slide now, really, for me, sort of in thinking about it, if I've learned anything from the case that Sylvia and I have been exploring, where maybe less so, but there were also some really strong external pressures, financial pressures, particularly on that company. If I've learned anything from that, then that whilst the pandemic may call for distributed leadership, it is the very particular contextual influences of the pandemic at an omnibus and discrete level that might just counteract, undermine our positive attempts to take colleagues with us through this, because the very discrete contextual influence of remote working has changed, is changing, and will change the way we take up our roles, the way we relate, and the way we communicate, and often in an asynchronous way, may really challenge our potential to take up and to seek collaboration, our perception of being able to influence multidirectionally. It may also inhibit our ability to seek that social affirmation through interactions with students or other staff as us as or me as an effective academic leader that otherwise would happen more naturally face to face. And the very severe economic uncertainty and complexity, and the way in which sometimes some decisions have to be made rapidly, at other times we have time, may create an environment where there's a perceived pull towards central decision-making control that again could potentially counteract individual member staff's feeling of self-efficacy, autonomy. So that then, may create some real challenges for us going forward. One in finding our way through this, and in a way that we don't disadvantage the potential for those who would have otherwise developed their academic leadership capacity, developed on a career path because of these very contextual influences. So I'll pause here because I'm really interested to hear other thoughts on, one, the research project I introduced you to you, the contextual approach that we've adopted, and or maybe really some of my very early reflections on what that could mean for us in terms of making sense of the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doris. That was very interesting. Are there any questions in the chat, or does anyone wish to answer a question? Or ask a question, I should say. Kareem, would you like to ask a question? Kareem, I think you may be muted, are you?
Yeah, no
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Hi, Doris. It's Kareem from Computing and Digital Media. Welcome to London Met University. A very interesting presentation, and I would like to ask a very generic question. As you know better than I do, sort of a successful leadership development implementation strategy, to my knowledge, is based on the use of sort of a coherent set of processes and instruments that address all dimensions of leadership. For instance, effectiveness of management teams, the quality of individual leaders, and the organization's leadership culture. I just would like to know, I mean, I've been interacting with businesses in the last 20 years, and I've been involved in how those processes vary, or how different are they when you move from businesses to higher education?
Yeah, so, well, this is again where, quite rightly, you know, while some aspects of what you said absolutely, you know, ought to apply everywhere, because in order, you know, what you said really reflects what this organisation didn't do well enough, and that is to take a holistic approach to leadership development and think about the alignment of everything from the particular competencies that an organisation wants to develop to, you know, how they are encouraging that, how that is, and the extent to which that is aligned with other values in the organisation, and evaluated on a regular basis. So those aspects arguably transcend different organisational contexts as a sort of best practice guide to developing leadership. But there are other aspects, of course, that, you know, you need to very much take in consideration when you think about, well, what kind of leadership behaviours, competencies and ways of relating to others are appropriate for different types of organisations. And with higher education, you get, for example, you get that very complex mix between a naturally very bureaucratic setup of structures, one that is striving to be very transparent, as well as individuals who seek and who might have the desire to be really quite autonomous. So what you can then see quite often in higher education institutions is a kind of push-pull effect, yeah, between trying to give autonomy that people are craving for, but also a perceived constant pull back to more central decision making about resources, about time allocations, etc. That is a dynamic that is more unique to this particular sector compared to, you know, a slightly different dynamics in smaller private sector organisations where the structures might be different.
Thank you, Doris.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Would anybody else like to ask a question? Beatrice, you'd like to ask a question, please do. Don't forget to turn your mic on. And then Klaus.
Mm-hmm.
Beatrice, are you there? In which case, Klaus, are you there?
Can you hear me, sir?
We can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Beatrice.
I was on the leadership distribution.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that with leadership, yes, we have to work in collaboration with the managers and our peers and lower down. But then, if we are to distribute leadership in every level, doesn't mean dilute the myth surrounding leadership, both in theory and in practice?
Yeah, so I guess that reflects, you know, different views on what leadership should be like, what it should do, what it is there for, and I think whenever I talk about distributed leadership, and I'm not necessarily saying, you know, this is what we all have to do. I think it is a very nice idea, a very nice discourse that is very appealing, because it has this participatory ideal, whereas the lived reality, as I said earlier, is often one of push and pull, and that is linked to, you know, very deep-rooted assumption that good leadership needs to be visible. It needs to be accountable, and that is where we find it very difficult to move away from thinking about leadership as a process of influencing, where really whether we are the leader or the follower doesn't matter so much. But that is an idea that's very difficult for us to take on. Our natural reaction is so often to go and seek individual accountability and to go back to thinking about the leader rather than leadership. And I think that is one of the reasons, there's this link to authority and perceived need to, as a leader, have authority, be in a management position, that we end up seeing organizations failing to really being able to embrace this idea of multi-influencing and collaboration.
Thank you. Klaus, sorry, did you want to come back, Beatrice?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Did you have a follow-up to that answer?
I think yes, to some degree, because the leadership, I've been in companies. I'm a public sector member of the Institute of Public Sector Management. I've been in management for over 20 years in public sector, local authorities and other, and also a member of the Institute of Leadership. Yeah. And with leadership, working in companies, yes, we have to give our subordinates some kind of autonomy to be authentic in themselves. But then if we're looking at the main organizational chart where the CEO sits and subordinates cannot kind of have the final say, or everything is like a student trying to be the vice chancellor, if you see what I mean. They can so there should always be that power for the overall. Other than that, there will be no need for organizational structure. There will be a flat structure rather than hierarchy structure. So that's the only bit that I be confused about, and I need clarity, because as we are living, I know in the 21st century with technology, everything, everyone has the information, and people doing research might even have more information than the leader in a particular topic or area. But then we shouldn't dilute the capacity and the capability of the overall leader.
Yeah. So, well, again, I don't necessarily profess to see distributed leadership as the only way of doing, and actually there is many reasons why a pure form of distributed leadership is almost impossible to enact. Why there may be a very, very important need to assign individual responsibilities and accountabilities to managerial positions. I think if we go with the idea of distributed leadership as a concept, then what it is trying to do is to disconnect leadership from the need to just focus on the individual. So, this is not to say that there is never going to be a hierarchy or there are managers. And there has been a lot of critique around distributed leadership for not addressing enough the power dynamics. And as we saw in this particular case study, it was the power dynamics of a senior management team who really had to be accountable, who had to demonstrate, had to show performance improvements. And as much as, they may have bought into the idea of the participatory idea of distributed leadership and wanting to really empower everybody else, they also needed to be seen to have answers and perform. So with our particular approach, what we're able to do is to highlight some of these inherent power dynamics. But as to what is the ultimate, the best approach, as you say, you've got a lot of experience yourself, and there may be very good reasons why an organisation may not want to or may not be able to, choose to buy into this distributed leadership ideal, and it is to a large extent an ideal.
Thanks, Doris. Just a reminder,
Yeah,
could you please mute your microphones when you're not talking? We're getting a bit of
okay,
reverb.
one more question, please, sir.
No, Beatrice, no more questions. We must move on. Other people would like to ask a question. If there's any time left, then by all means come back. But I think we need to give given that a good run. Klaus, you're next.
Okay.
Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. We're just going out anyway. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Klaus.
We can chat all the time.
It was brilliant.
Lovely, Beatrice. Thank you. Klaus, do you wish to ask a question?
Oh, I'm not sure. I think I can't quite hear what you're saying, Klaus.
I want to say this is a new approach.
Beatrice, could you mute your microphone now so that Klaus can ask a question, please?
Okay, so I should.
Or perhaps Anne could do it. Klaus has poor reception. Does anyone? Okay, so so maybe we'll ask any other questions out there, any other theme. Doris, I might put myself in the indulgence of chair's action there, chair's whatever you call it, chair's privilege. I'm interested in the whole issue of time here. So, in a way, the most valuable commodity to me when I was starting out as a lecturer was time, and I thought it was worth being paid less than I might have got as an accountant or whatever else. If I had time to essentially think, which means to write things, and it's all become much more organised in inverted commas now in the 30 years, 27 years I've been doing this. And set against that, there is also the issue of time, which but not just the preciousness of it, but the elasticity of time. So if you relate that fact to the control of time, the control of the labour process, which is me, the old labour historian, putting myself up against you, the HRM person, and often labour historians and HRM people sit in the same departments, don't they? And many labour historians have become, people who go from looking at production to consumption or whatever. So it's interesting. But anyway, so there's a question then of how important control of time is and what value that has and whether that can be measured in these terms. And secondly, in COVID terms, those who have no idea how difficult COVID times are would actually say, oh, well, it's only 3 months. Is it an article? Is it half an article? But actually, the question is, what is the elasticity of time when something like this happens, bearing in mind that for all those people who have got 2 kids at home and they're homeschooling them, there's somebody else who doesn't have anything like that and for whom this is a joy, So there's 2 relationships to time that I wouldn't mind your reflections on from the leadership context and when you mentioned things like promotion, so opportunity.
So so I think I'm taking here the lead from this very quick, to be fair, piece of research that our colleagues at Henley have done, and we see that talk about potential long-term implications in other spheres of media and other spheres of life, sort of when we hear on the news, for example, about the potential implications of the pandemic. And I think with regards to leadership and leadership development, you'll be aware of over a space of time, the ideal of what we want from leadership, who we think would make a good leader, what kind of competencies are required for leadership. This aspect of, if somebody comes up for interview and or we promote somebody into what we seem to be as a leadership position, whilst we're all working against bias, there certainly is, at different points in time, a dominant ideal of what we would like to see. Now, with regards to the academic life, I think, we all know that there will be certain criteria by which we are judged. And I think what Walker and colleagues are concerned with, and I would be concerned with, is that there are long-term influences on how the pandemic displays a leadership ideal, which may harken back to more centralized, heroic ideals. Whilst it may only be a span of 3 months where 1 or 2 papers are delayed, I think the concern with regards to research and research outputs or ability to engage in research is, it may not affect so much those who are much, much further on in their career and have the time, have established and carved out their niche, but it might create a fallout of those who are falling more and more behind with where they thought they were with regards to advancing their careers on a research side of things. So I think there is a number of things that we might see occur, and I recently saw, and actually I circulated earlier today amongst colleagues, a special issue that has been published in the journal Leadership, where other leadership scholars, maybe those who are further on their career, do not have teaching responsibilities. Some of them are actually also retired. They produced very quickly thinking pieces around the COVID impact of COVID on leadership, or leadership perspectives on COVID. And that triggered a variety of thought processes in me, I have to admit, anything from, I'm not sure that's very well peer reviewed, to, those are some of the little signs of maybe some of the ways in which it is starting to disadvantage those who cannot respond as quickly, who might feel left behind or left out. Now, fast forwarding into 5 years' time, could be that there is no such lag, there's no such long-term impact on development of leaders, or it could mean that right now, we carry as an organisation some responsibility to think about, what are we doing to counteract even these little disappointments that or pressures that people might be experiencing.
Yeah, I agree with much of that.
Yeah.
And I think the thing is, I actually think that small periods can actually be turning points, because you don't actually know if it's a turning point because you go in a different direction. It's the kind of the what if, It is interesting here. Our applications for the kind of fast track, quick response COVID calls from the research councils, I think they've all been from women. But in the interest of absolute transparency, I'm involved in one of those and was quite heavily involved in, co-conceptualizing it. So you'd have to say it's a bit more 50-50 or something. But the others have been. So that's interesting. But I think, if you make a name now in COVID research, if you are lucky to get £200,000 off Medical Research Council in within 6 weeks or 3 weeks or 2 weeks to do research, and it would normally have taken you 9 months to get a response from the Medical Research Council for what is your own love, you become a COVID expert and you are retooled with that boosterism, and that will utterly transform you, I would say. It will push you ahead of your peers. And we were all very proud of the people at London Met who are leaders in the media around COVID and whatnot, and you think this is a great opportunity, but people are dying for this opportunity, so it's a serious issue, way beyond questions of leadership in universities. That's just my comment. Would you like to come back on anything I said there, Doris?
No, I mean, apart from saying, it's I think it's great when individuals can respond so swiftly to absolutely, and it could. So what we could see, those who are able to jump onto this for all the right reasons, as you say, it could really expel. But I think what it might do, and we see this, talk about this in other spheres such as education, etc., where it could go either way. So those who really jump quite far, and those who don't start to lag behind further and further.
Klaus has written us a short essay in which he's holding a small onion to his eye. I mustn't make jokes. I'm asking as an outsider. I was a bit surprised that the contextual approach is underrepresented in leadership research. Leadership, I guess, has to do with institutional culture, and cultures are inert and replicate, presumably themselves. The picture you painted is a bit depressing, as both the Polish case, as your comments about COVID seem to suggest that in the crisis, there is no chance for distributed leadership. Are there any examples where change of direction into centralization have not worked as a starting point for a more distributed leadership culture?
Yeah. Okay. So without necessarily Hazel responded, depends on the context, not in education.
Yeah, Hazel's next. She's going to ask a question. I'm going to lower her hand, but make sure her on next.
Fantastic. No, okay. So very briefly, to Klaus's comment, it is featuring more the consideration of context, and context means a whole variety of things. Absolutely, it can mean culture, it can mean physical space, symbolic space, it can mean spatial, it can mean time. Whilst you see some of this and it becoming a stronger field, with regards to leadership development, actually, formally, there is very, very little. There is very little on this, which is really scary, given how so many of very Western models and concepts of leadership are being exported on global leadership development programs. As for, do I know a case where moving from a distributed leadership culture to centralization has worked? Well, I mean, that comes with its complexity as well, and I think it is rooted, as you quite rightly say, Klaus, to the extent to which, once you have a very pervasive, strong culture, it is replicating. It is very, very difficult because it's so pervasive in terms of not only the institutional structures, but also in terms of people's identities, in terms of the way people behave and relate to others. Well, I have some feedback on why. It's very, very difficult to change indeed. And is it pessimistic? Well, maybe, but maybe it is a sort of a wake up call. Certainly, you have counter examples. I'm thinking of another very popular example, Nissan Smoothies. Now, they started off very almost anarchist, distributed in their approach to setting up an organization and also running an organization. And as they grew larger and larger, again, they had these really strong contextual, wider omnibus contextual influences on them of having to create structures that make them more accountable to the outside world. And now, they then, as they started to create those structures, had real tensions and real difficulties internally of people resisting, adapting to these. But of course, then as you have new members of staff coming in who maybe were already attuned to a more formal or normal way of organizing, unfortunately normalized way of organizing, they then started to maybe diffuse the influence of those older members of staff, or older not being age-wise, but in terms of how long they've been in the organization. And so there is opportunities for organizations to change, absolutely, but it is very, very difficult because, as you quite rightly say, they are so persistent. I think Hazel is adding some really interesting comments. Now, Hazel, did you want to, I know you had your hand up earlier, did you want to ask a question as well? I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether I have. Yes, Hazel, please go ahead. I think you need to unmute and then fire away.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Oh gosh, out here in the sticks, I live in rural Essex. Our broadband is very slow, and this time of day. So thanks, Doris. You've tapped a nerve with me, because when we spoke, and I realised that we were on the same page with the contextualisation of understanding and the importance of separating leader and leadership.
Yeah.
So, and I've been bouncing around here because you brought up lots of things, especially with that Henley research and how distributed leadership and how it's stretched over, as Richard Bolden would say, I've got it here,
Yes.
a collective cultural process emerging through the interactions of multiple actors, and I'd say context, artifacts, etc. as well. Here we are in our context, okay, and academic leadership for many years at our institution was hijacked by academic management. Okay, and sorry everyone that's been caught up in that, we weren't to blame or anything, and we were just beginning to come out of that. And academic leadership is not necessarily held by someone in a hierarchical position. It can be quite a new member of staff who has got a particular area that they're interested in. So how, if you like, in this particular context, could you professors, Don, Doris, advise these individuals with the potential to demonstrate academic leadership in their field, to be able to continue and feel as if in the future there might be something worth going towards, because the steady march of the system is drowning us all out at the moment. I think drowning us all out, I think what the Henley research was saying was the demands of family, the demands of learning new technology, and etc. It's getting the headspace to be able to. We need to find practical responses so that those of us who are, even if we're grey-haired, continue to aspire, can feel as if we can carry it. Now, have you got any thoughts from the wines? And you, Don, as well.
Well, actually, I mean, that's a training session. I don't think it's really, I mean, I would never publish on this subject. I'm not an expert on it, but I mean, I have a training session just waiting for us to announce the next promotion round, and I'll certainly run that. But actually, but a professor is the acme of this trade for the majority of people. And I think there is the big question for me is the distinction between a professor, a leader, and a manager. A professor can be all three. A manager, just by definition, if that's their first variable, probably can't be all three. And leaders, well, we've all got different perspectives on leaders, and as you've all shown today, there's a huge, intellectual hubbub around it. But I think academia is actually different to a company or to many companies, and that's probably wrong, and that's probably my great failing, and I may well have explained now why you feel the way you do, Hazel, but I do think it's different from ICI, say.
And that's partly to do with a higher education institution, of course, is made up of different groups. And they, from the academic groups, administrative groups, support service or services, etc. And so, the requirement for management, and management meaning the management of resources in the wider sense, both staff as well as structural and physical resources, is of course in a higher education institution key to traversing all of these different groups, where leadership technically, and this is certainly also, the ethos behind distributed leadership isn't something that that is the same as managing those very structured ways of organizing. It may be a core aspect or something that you want to do, but leadership in the traditional sense of influencing isn't even something that just has to go from a leader towards a follower. It can be a process of mutual influencing, of multiple, in this sense, professional academics coming together. And I think this, Hazel, is where I think we're probably thinking alike. And how can we support staff who feel overwhelmed, who feel isolated, who feel, particularly with regards to academic sense of research or teaching? What can we do? I think well, first of all, we have some sort of duty to support, and to create spaces where we can support each other that are not necessarily about the ins and outs of this is how you turn out collaborate, or where you create spaces to share experiences, to maybe reassure that what you're doing is good. Okay, because even with students, and I think this is also something that the Henley study showed, it's much more difficult to get the kind of sense, the affirmation that what you're doing is right or what you're doing is good. So when then also maybe care and responsibility take over, that is actually potentially quite a grim space to be, or place to be in. So taking responsibilities maybe also by those who are seen to be in positions of decision making, whether it is, as Don said, training workshops to say, hey, look, this might be quite grim, but this is something to work towards. But also in conversation, showing honesty in, acknowledging that how difficult a situation may be, and that in the moment it isn't possible to do everything. Okay. But that needs to then be backed up by assurances that that will be taken into consideration during decision-making processes in the future.
Okay, listen, folks.
Thank you very much.
In the business school,
yes,
you could
absolutely.
take that off camera, and of course, I agree. By the way, we have a duty to support and provide space, and that's one of the things we have to do to create, a sense of leadership right at the beginning. I think the point that Hazel made is very apposite, that we have promotion criteria at the point at which there is promotion, but actually there should be job description expectations that use that same language, of course, lighter and lighter the further back you go towards the fullest level of an experience just after a PhD or just after a master's or whatever it is. And then you should be, aware of what the track is that suddenly will become glaringly obvious when you wish to be an ATP or a reader or something. Right. Anyway, I didn't want to take the floor there. I think we need to wrap now. We've actually run over 10 minutes. I didn't want us to do that, but that was a very good discussion and well worth it. So I guess those who wanted to stay and listen stayed, and some people went up to their dinner. So listen, thank you all very much. Just to say that this time next week we have Yolanda Arazo and Stephen Hills talking about COVID research. So do tune in at 4 o'clock next week. Look after yourselves, stay well, and see you again. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.